In 188 BCE, Rome did not yet administer Asia Minor as a unified imperial possession, yet its authority already shaped the political decisions of kings across the region. Roman influence extended not through permanent garrisons but through treaties, arbitration, and inherited obligations. The transformation of Anatolia from a Hellenistic mosaic into a sphere of Roman intervention began decades earlier, with the fragmentation of a vast empire. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE initiated a prolonged struggle among his generals, known as the Diadochi. Without a mature administrative successor, the Macedonian Empire fractured into competing monarchies. Anatolia, positioned between Europe and the Near East, became a strategic corridor contested by rival claimants. Control of its coastal cities ensured access to Aegean trade, while its inland plateaus connected Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Black Sea. Geography alone ensured that no successor state could ignore the peninsula. By the early 3rd century BCE, large portions of Anatolia fell under the authority of the Seleucid Empire. Seleucid administration relied on satrapal governance, urban foundations, and garrison cities. Greek polis along the western coast retained varying degrees of autonomy, while inland populations preserved older Anatolian and Persian traditions. Epigraphic evidence from cities such as Sardis and Ephesus indicates a layered political environment, where local magistrates operated within broader royal frameworks. This hybrid system maintained relative stability but depended heavily on strong centralized kingship. The balance began to shift in the 2nd century BCE. Seleucid power weakened under external pressures and internal revolts. In western Anatolia, the Attalid dynasty of Pergamon expanded its influence. Pergamon cultivated close diplomatic ties with Rome, particularly during conflicts against Macedon. Roman victories in the Macedonian Wars increased its prestige as a Mediterranean arbiter. According to Polybius, Roman diplomacy increasingly shaped interstate disputes even before permanent annexations occurred. A decisive transformation followed the Roman defeat of Antiochus III at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE. Roman forces, allied with Pergamon and Rhodes, overcame Seleucid armies near Magnesia ad Sipylum in western Anatolia. Ancient sources, including Livy and Appian, record that the subsequent Treaty of Apamea in 188 BCE imposed severe territorial restrictions on Seleucid holdings west of the Taurus Mountains. These lands were transferred not to Rome directly but to its allies, primarily Pergamon. Rome avoided immediate annexation, yet its strategic influence expanded decisively. The redistribution of territory elevated Pergamon into the dominant Anatolian power. The Attalid rulers implemented administrative reforms, promoted urbanization, and invested in monumental architecture, as confirmed by archaeological remains on the Pergamene Acropolis. However, their authority depended on Roman favor. Rome, in turn, gained leverage without committing to continuous military occupation. This indirect system reflected a broader Roman preference during the mid-Republic, influence without overextension. Stability persisted for several decades, though underlying tensions remained. The Attalid state governed diverse populations across western Anatolia. Local elites navigated between loyalty to Pergamon and engagement with Roman negotiators. Economic integration intensified as maritime trade routes connected Aegean ports with Italian markets. Inscriptions from Delos demonstrate increasing Italian commercial presence in eastern Mediterranean trade by the mid-2nd century BCE. Financial networks extended beyond diplomacy into private enterprise. A structural shift occurred in 133 BCE with the death of Attalus III. Without a direct heir, Attalus bequeathed his kingdom to Rome in his will. Roman sources describe this transfer as lawful inheritance. The Senate accepted the bequest and organized the territory into the province of Asia. This marked the first major Roman province in Anatolia. Administration relied on senatorial governors, tax farming contracts, and judicial circuits. Roman fiscal policy soon altered regional dynamics. The publicani, private tax contractors drawn largely from the equestrian order, assumed responsibility for revenue collection. Contemporary accounts, including later commentary by Cicero, indicate that tax farming practices could become burdensome. Provincial cities faced indemnities, tribute requirements, and fluctuating assessments. While Roman governance brought standardized legal frameworks, it also integrated Anatolia into a revenue system centered on the Roman state. The transformation was gradual rather than immediate. Urban institutions remained intact, and Greek civic culture continued to flourish. However, sovereignty had shifted. Rome now possessed a formal administrative presence in western Anatolia, backed by military capacity. The Hellenistic equilibrium that once balanced Seleucid, Macedonian, and local powers had given way to asymmetry. Rome's authority, initially diplomatic, had become territorial. By the late 2nd century BCE, Anatolia no longer functioned as a competitive arena of equal monarchies. Instead, it had become a frontier between direct Roman administration in the west and semi-independent kingdoms to the east. This frontier condition would prove unstable. As Roman influence expanded from inherited obligation into structured governance, political space narrowed for regional powers seeking autonomy. Among those powers, a kingdom along the southern coast of the Black Sea was consolidating resources, alliances, and military capacity. Before continuing deeper into the historical narrative, viewers are encouraged to subscribe to the channel and enable notifications to receive each new installment of Nightfall history. Consistent engagement, including comments on specific sections or themes of interest, helps support the continued production of academically researched, long-form historical documentaries. In the shadow of Rome's growing dominance, Pontus developed as a hybrid state, Persian in lineage, Greek in language, Anatolian in geography. Its emergence was not sudden but gradual, shaped by the political fragmentation that followed the collapse of Alexander's empire and by the enduring influence of Achaemenid administrative traditions in northern Anatolia. The kingdom of Pontus originated in the early 3rd century BCE under Mithridates I Eupator. Following the weakening of Seleucid authority in Asia Minor, Mithridates established control over territories along the southern coast of the Black Sea. The region's mountainous terrain provided natural defensive advantages, while its river valleys connected inland Anatolia with maritime trade routes. Unlike the heavily urbanized western coast, northern Anatolia retained strong rural aristocratic structures. Pontic rule adapted to this environment by integrating local nobility rather than displacing it. The dynasty claimed descent from Persian nobility connected to the Achaemenid court. This lineage was emphasized in royal titulature and court ceremonial practices. Numismatic evidence from early Pontic coinage reflects a deliberate blending of cultural symbols. Greek inscriptions appeared alongside imagery evoking Persian royal authority. This dual presentation allowed the monarchy to communicate legitimacy across diverse constituencies. Greek-speaking urban populations along the coast interacted with a ruling house that preserved Iranian dynastic traditions. During the 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, Pontus remained a secondary power compared to the Seleucid and Attalid kingdoms. However, shifting regional dynamics created opportunity. Seleucid control over Anatolia weakened due to internal revolts and external pressures. Pergamon expanded westward with Roman backing, but its influence did not fully penetrate the Black Sea hinterland. Pontus gradually extended its authority inland, consolidating control over Paphlagonia and parts of Cappadocia. Archaeological surveys in northern Anatolia indicate increasing fortification during this period, suggesting coordinated territorial defense. Economic development reinforced political consolidation. The southern Black Sea coast functioned as a corridor linking the Mediterranean with the Eurasian steppe. Grain, timber, metals, and slaves moved through Pontic ports. Greek colonies such as Sinope and Amasea served as administrative and commercial centers. Control over these cities enabled the monarchy to regulate maritime trade while maintaining ties with Hellenistic urban networks. Inscriptions from Sinope demonstrate continued civic autonomy under royal oversight, indicating a negotiated form of governance rather than direct suppression. Pontic administration combined inherited satrapal models with Hellenistic bureaucratic elements. Royal authority remained centralized, yet local governance operated through established municipal institutions. This structure reduced resistance among urban elites while ensuring fiscal extraction. Revenue derived from agricultural estates, port duties, and resource exploitation in the interior. The Black Sea fisheries and timber reserves contributed to naval capacity, an asset that would later become strategically significant The 2nd century BCE marked a decisive phase of expansion. As Pergamon strengthened its western territories, Pontus extended influence eastward and southward. Dynastic marriages reinforced alliances within Cappadocia, while military campaigns secured contested borderlands. Ancient sources, including Strabo, describe the gradual enlargement of Pontic authority across interior Anatolia. Though Strabo wrote centuries later, his geographical accounts reflect enduring administrative boundaries established during this period. The kingdom's resilience derived in part from geography. Mountain ranges shielded inland centers from rapid invasion, while coastal access ensured economic sustainability. Unlike the open plains of western Anatolia, Pontus could mobilize defensive positions across narrow passes and elevated terrain. This geographic advantage fostered a tradition of militarized regional control. Fortified settlements uncovered in modern excavations reveal sustained investment in defensive infrastructure. Religious policy further strengthened cohesion. The Pontic monarchy supported both Greek civic cults and Iranian-derived royal religious practices. Temples dedicated to Zeus and local Anatolian deities coexisted with symbols associated with Persian kingship. This inclusive religious environment allowed the ruling house to maintain legitimacy across ethnically diverse populations. Records indicate that priestly offices often overlapped with local aristocratic families, linking sacred authority with political administration. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Pontus had evolved from a peripheral dynastic state into a structured regional power. It possessed defensible borders, diversified revenue streams, naval access, and dynastic continuity. Unlike client kingdoms dependent entirely on Roman arbitration, Pontus maintained strategic autonomy. It navigated diplomatic relations cautiously, avoiding premature confrontation while expanding its sphere of influence. The broader Anatolian balance had already shifted westward under Roman oversight. Yet beyond the formal boundaries of the province of Asia, Pontus represented a different model of governance, centralized monarchy rooted in both Persian and Hellenistic traditions. This hybrid identity provided flexibility in diplomacy and internal administration. It also positioned the kingdom as a potential counterweight to Roman expansion. By the final decades of the 2nd century BCE, the structures necessary for sustained resistance were already in place. Economic resources, fortified terrain, administrative integration, and dynastic legitimacy converged within the Pontic state. Leadership would determine how these assets were deployed. Within a generation, the throne would pass to a ruler whose ambitions extended far beyond defensive preservation. The first clash began as a border dispute but escalated into a regional revolt. What appeared initially as a localized confrontation between neighboring kingdoms quickly expanded into a systemic challenge to Roman authority across Asia Minor. By the late 90s BCE, tensions between the Kingdom of Pontus and the Kingdom of Bithynia had intensified. Bithynia, ruled by Nicomedes IV, functioned increasingly as a Roman-aligned monarchy. Roman arbitration had repeatedly intervened in Bithynian succession disputes, reinforcing the kingdom's dependency on senatorial approval. Pontus, under Mithridates VI, viewed this alignment as strategic encirclement. Control of Bithynia meant influence over the approaches to the Black Sea and access to northern Anatolian trade corridors. Ancient accounts, particularly those of Appian, suggest that Roman officials encouraged Nicomedes to assert territorial claims against Pontus. Whether driven by senatorial directive or local initiative, Bithynian forces conducted raids into territories claimed by Mithridates in 89 BCE. These incursions likely aimed to provoke a confrontation that would justify Roman intervention. The Roman Senate, however, was simultaneously preoccupied with internal tensions and conflicts in Italy. Mithridates responded with rapid mobilization. Pontic forces advanced westward, targeting Bithynian strongholds and Roman detachments stationed in the region. The geography of northwestern Anatolia favored swift campaigning. River valleys and established road networks enabled coordinated troop movements. Within months, Pontic armies defeated Bithynian forces in multiple engagements. Roman commanders, including provincial officials responsible for Asia, were caught unprepared. The early Roman military response suffered from fragmentation. Provincial forces consisted largely of limited garrisons and allied contingents rather than concentrated legions. According to Appian, Roman commanders Manius Aquilius and Gaius Cassius attempted to organize resistance but were defeated in successive encounters. Aquilius was eventually captured. These defeats demonstrated the vulnerability of Roman Eastern administration when confronted by a coordinated regional power. Underlying the military confrontation was a broader context of provincial dissatisfaction. Since the creation of the province of Asia in 133 BCE, Roman fiscal practices had generated significant resentment. Tax farming contracts granted to publicani imposed heavy burdens on urban communities. Cicero's later speeches against Verres provide insight into the systemic nature of such exploitation, even if composed decades afterward. Financial extraction, combined with judicial inequality between Roman citizens and provincials, eroded local loyalty. Mithridates capitalized on this environment. His proclamations framed the conflict not merely as defense against Bithynia but as liberation from Roman oppression. Greek cities in Asia Minor had long traditions of civic autonomy. Roman oversight, especially when tied to economic hardship, was perceived as intrusive. The Pontic king's cultivated image as a Philhellene ruler resonated with urban elites. Inscriptions and coinage from this period emphasize Hellenistic royal symbolism, reinforcing legitimacy among Greek-speaking populations. Military successes accelerated political realignment. As Pontic forces advanced into the province of Asia, local cities evaluated their strategic interests. Some opened their gates voluntarily. Others were compelled by force. The collapse of Roman field resistance created a perception of irreversible momentum. Pontic troops secured key urban centers, including Ephesus and Pergamon. Control of these cities disrupted Roman administrative networks and severed communication lines with the Aegean. The Roman Senate's capacity to respond was constrained by internal instability. Political rivalry between populares and optimates complicated decision-making. The social war in Italy had only recently concluded, straining manpower and resources. Eastern commanders operated without immediate reinforcement from Rome. This delay allowed Mithridates to consolidate gains before full-scale Roman intervention could be organized. The crisis also revealed structural differences between Roman and Pontic strategic models. Roman authority in Asia relied on provincial governors with limited standing forces, supported by allied kings. Pontus, by contrast, mobilized a centralized army drawn from its own territories and supplemented by regional allies. This concentration of command under a single monarch allowed rapid coordination. The defeats of Roman-aligned forces underscored the risks inherent in indirect imperial governance without permanent military infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from western Anatolia indicates disruption layers in several cities dating to this period. While not uniformly destructive, these layers correspond with reported military movements. Coin hoards discovered in the region suggest economic instability and rapid shifts in control. Such material evidence aligns with textual accounts describing widespread upheaval. By late 89 BCE, the immediate objective of repelling Bithynian aggression had evolved into a broader campaign against Roman presence in Asia Minor. Mithridates had neutralized neighboring opposition and dismantled provincial defenses. The Bithynian monarchy, dependent on Roman backing, proved incapable of sustained resistance. Roman commanders retreated or were eliminated. The confrontation had thus moved beyond bilateral rivalry. It exposed the fragility of Roman authority in the eastern Mediterranean when challenged by coordinated regional power and local dissatisfaction. What began as a dispute over border claims now threatened the entire structure of Roman influence east of the Aegean. Military victories provided Mithridates not only territorial gains but political leverage. With Roman forces expelled from much of Asia Minor, he possessed the opportunity to redefine the regional order on his own terms. In a single day, Roman authority in Asia Minor collapsed. What years of diplomatic influence and fiscal integration had constructed was dismantled through coordinated violence across dozens of cities. In 88 BCE, following his rapid military victories in Bithynia and the province of Asia, Mithridates VI initiated one of the most consequential acts of the late Hellenistic period. According to Appian, Royal orders were distributed to cities throughout Asia Minor, instructing them to kill all Roman and Italian residents on a designated day. Plutarch likewise describes the event as centrally coordinated, though precise details vary among sources. Ancient estimates claim approximately 80,000 victims, while some later traditions inflate the number further. Modern scholarship treats these figures cautiously, yet the scale of violence remains undisputed. The victims consisted primarily of Roman citizens, Italian merchants, tax contractors, and their families. Many were involved in financial administration, especially tax farming operations linked to the public money. Since the establishment of the province of Asia in 133 BCE, Roman economic presence had grown substantially. Commercial networks connected Anatolian ports to Delos and Italian markets. The elimination of these residents therefore targeted not only individuals but the institutional infrastructure of Roman provincial authority. Records indicate that the killings were executed simultaneously in numerous cities, including Ephesus, Pergamon, and Tralles. Appian reports that sanctuary seekers in temples were not spared. Whether these accounts contain rhetorical exaggeration, the coordinated timing suggests deliberate planning. Orders appear to have required local participation, implicating civic authorities in the violence. Compliance may have been motivated by fear, opportunism, or accumulated resentment toward Roman fiscal practices. The massacre removed immediate Roman administrative capacity in the region. Without resident tax collectors, judicial officials, or commercial intermediaries, Rome's practical governance in Asia disintegrated. Communication lines with Italy were severed. Provincial resistance was no longer limited to battlefield engagements. It now encompassed urban political realignment. Cities that participated effectively severed ties with Rome and aligned themselves with Mithridates. The structural conditions enabling such coordination were rooted in preceding decades. Roman tax farming contracts often imposed fixed revenue quotas regardless of local economic fluctuation. Cicero's later references to abuses by publicani illustrate widespread provincial grievances, even if written in a different political context. Inscriptions from several Anatolian cities document financial strain during the late 2nd century BCE. While Rome maintained legal authority, it did not always maintain equitable administration. The massacre therefore occurred within a climate of dissatisfaction rather than spontaneous uprising. Mithridates' political calculation appears twofold. First, the removal of Roman and Italian residents prevented immediate counter-organization within occupied territories. Second, the act bound participating cities to his cause. By engaging local elites in irreversible action against Rome, he reduced the possibility of rapid defection once Roman forces returned. The decision transformed passive acquiescence into active complicity. Numismatic evidence from 88 to 87 BCE reflects the transition. Coinage issued in several cities during this period features Mithridatic symbols or titles, indicating formal acknowledgement of Pontic authority. The shift suggests that urban administrations integrated themselves into the new political order following the massacre. Rather than isolated incidents, the killings formed part of a broader strategy of regime replacement. Ancient narratives portray the episode as both liberation and atrocity. Appian emphasizes the brutality and treachery of the killings, reflecting Roman historiographical perspective. Greek sources, though less detailed, do not uniformly condemn the action. The divergence highlights the interpretive divide between Roman and provincial viewpoints. What Roman authors described as massacre, some local populations may have perceived as expulsion of exploitative authority. The elimination of Roman residents also disrupted commercial stability. Merchant networks that facilitated grain shipments, credit arrangements, and maritime insurance vanished abruptly. Archaeological evidence of coin hoards buried in 88 BCE suggests widespread uncertainty. Economic dislocation likely followed the violence, even as Pontic forces consolidated territorial control. The immediate political objective was achieved at the cost of long-term regional instability. From a strategic perspective, the Asiatic Vespers marked the definitive escalation of the conflict. Prior engagements had targeted armies and allied monarchies. This action targeted civilian populations tied to Roman sovereignty. The war was no longer a contest between kings but a confrontation between imperial systems. By authorizing coordinated killings, Mithridates ensured that reconciliation with Rome would become unlikely without decisive Roman retaliation. The Roman Republic, already strained by internal political rivalry between figures such as Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, now faced an external crisis demanding response. The massacre not only challenged Roman authority but publicly humiliated it. Provincial administration had collapsed, allied kings had been defeated, and thousands of Roman citizens were dead. By the end of 88 BCE, Asia Minor was effectively under Pontic control. Roman influence had been expelled through coordinated urban violence rather than sustained siege. The Republic, preoccupied with civil conflict yet confronted with unprecedented provocation, would be compelled to reorganize its eastern strategy under unified military command. Peace in Anatolia lasted barely 3 years before suspicion turned into renewed aggression. The settlement that concluded the First Mithridatic War resolved immediate hostilities, yet it left the underlying balance of power fundamentally unchanged. In 85 BCE, the Peace of Dardanus was negotiated between Lucius Cornelius Sulla and Mithridates VI. According to Appian, Mithridates agreed to surrender occupied territories in Asia Minor, pay a substantial indemnity, and provide ships to the Roman fleet. In return, he retained his throne and core Pontic territories. The agreement reflected Roman pragmatism. Sulla required rapid settlement in the east to address political instability in Italy. The treaty therefore restored territorial boundaries but did not dismantle Pontic sovereignty. The settlement imposed financial obligations on Pontus, yet it did not eliminate Mithridates' military capacity. Pontic forces withdrew from Roman provinces but remained intact within their homeland. The indemnity payments, though burdensome, did not fundamentally cripple the kingdom's economy. Coastal trade along the Black Sea continued. Inland estates remained productive. The strategic equilibrium had been reset rather than resolved. Following Sulla's departure, Roman forces remained stationed in Asia Minor under the command of Lucius Licinius Murena. Murena had served as one of Sulla's legates during the First War. His authority derived from prior appointment rather than new senatorial directive. This ambiguity contributed to later conflict. Roman sources indicate that Murena suspected Mithridates of violating treaty terms by rebuilding fortifications and recruiting troops. Evidence for Pontic rearmament is partially inferred from later accounts. Appian records that Mithridates began restoring defensive positions in Cappadocia and reinforcing frontier garrisons. From the Pontic perspective, such measures constituted legitimate security precautions. The treaty did not prohibit defensive preparation within sovereign territory. However, Murena interpreted these actions as preparation for renewed aggression. In 83 BCE, without explicit authorization from the Roman Senate, Murena advanced into Pontic-controlled territory. He justified the invasion on the grounds of treaty violations. The incursion targeted border districts and sought to test Pontic readiness. Initial engagements appear to have favored Roman forces, which conducted raids and seized local strongholds. Yet these operations lacked strategic depth. Murena did not command a full consular army but relied on provincial forces. Mithridates responded cautiously. Rather than initiating full mobilization, he dispatched envoys to Rome to protest Murena's actions. Appian describes these diplomatic appeals as efforts to demonstrate compliance with the Peace of Dardanus. Simultaneously, Mithridates consolidated troops within defensible terrain. The mountainous geography of Pontus favored defensive warfare. Fortified passes limited the maneuverability of Roman detachments. By 82 BCE, the balance shifted. Pontic forces engaged Roman units more directly and achieved localized victories. Murena's troops, operating without unified reinforcement from Italy, encountered logistical constraints. Supply lines extended through contested borderlands. Pontic counterattacks disrupted Roman positions and forced withdrawal from several captured sites. These engagements did not escalate into large-scale pitched battles but revealed the limitations of unilateral aggression. The Roman Senate, preoccupied with internal consolidation following Sulla's dictatorship, displayed limited enthusiasm for renewed Eastern war. Sulla's reforms aimed to stabilize the Republic after years of civil conflict. A prolonged campaign against Pontus risked diverting attention and resources. According to Appian, the Senate eventually ordered Murena to cease hostilities and restore peace. Murena complied, and Roman forces withdrew from Pontic territory. The Second Mithridatic War thus concluded without formal treaty renegotiation. No decisive territorial changes occurred. Mithridates retained his kingdom. Rome maintained its provinces in Asia and Bithynia. Yet the episode exposed structural fragility within the prior settlement. The absence of clearly defined enforcement mechanisms left room for unilateral interpretation. Roman commanders on the frontier possessed discretionary authority that could trigger escalation. Archaeological findings in northern Anatolia indicate continued fortification activity during the early 80s BCE. Defensive walls and garrison installations correspond chronologically with this period of instability. Numismatic evidence suggests that Pontic minting activity remained consistent, indicating sustained economic capacity despite indemnity payments. These material indicators support textual claims that Pontus preserved operational resilience after the First War. The brief conflict also influenced perceptions on both sides. For Rome, Murena's failure underscored the necessity of clearer command structures and senatorial oversight in Eastern affairs. For Mithridates, the incursion confirmed that Roman tolerance was conditional and potentially temporary. Even in the absence of open hostility, suspicion persisted. Defensive autonomy could be interpreted as aggression. Strategically, the Second Mithridatic War functioned as a test of endurance rather than a decisive confrontation. It demonstrated that Pontus could repel limited Roman advances while Rome could disrupt border regions without committing to full invasion. Neither side achieved conclusive dominance. Instead, the episode deepened mistrust and reinforced the expectation of future conflict. By 81 BCE, formal peace had been restored, yet the underlying rivalry remained unresolved. The Senate's recall of Murena prevented immediate escalation, but it did not redefine the strategic relationship. Mithridates continued to govern an intact and militarily viable kingdom. Rome retained administrative authority in western Anatolia but without permanent stabilization of its eastern frontier. Though limited in scale, Murena's provocation clarified a central reality. Coexistence between Rome and Pontus depended not on treaty language alone, but on sustained strategic deterrence. The events of 83 to 81 BCE therefore served as a preparatory phase, convincing Mithridates that any durable security would require stronger alliances, expanded military capacity, and anticipation of a larger confrontation. The Second War ended quietly, but preparation for a larger conflict had already begun. The absence of open hostilities between 81 and 75 BCE did not indicate reconciliation. Instead, both Rome and Pontus used the interval to consolidate power, reform institutions, and secure strategic advantages. Following Murena's withdrawal, Mithridates VI directed attention toward structural military reform. Ancient accounts, particularly those of Appian, indicate that the king expanded recruitment across his territories and reinforced frontier defenses. Fortifications in inland strongholds such as Amasea and along key mountain passes were strengthened. Archaeological surveys in northern Anatolia reveal expanded defensive walls and evidence of garrison activity dating to the early 1st century BCE. These measures suggest systematic investment in territorial security rather than temporary mobilization. Naval construction formed a central component of Mithridates' strategy. Control of the Black Sea ensured access to grain supplies, maritime trade, and communications with allied territories in the Bosporan Kingdom. Pontic shipyards increased production, drawing upon timber resources abundant in the region. The Black Sea Fleet provided both economic protection and military flexibility. During the First Mithridatic War, naval capacity had proven decisive in controlling coastal cities and disrupting Roman supply routes. Mithridates sought to prevent future vulnerability by maintaining maritime superiority in regional waters. Military reorganization also involved the diversification of troop composition. Pontic armies traditionally included infantry drawn from Anatolian populations, cavalry from inland aristocracies, and mercenary contingents from Greek cities. After the Second War, Mithridates expanded recruitment among Scythian and Thracian groups connected through Black Sea networks. This broader mobilization reflected a shift toward multi-ethnic coalition warfare. Numismatic issues from this period depict royal imagery emphasizing authority over a wide territorial domain, reinforcing the message of consolidated sovereignty. Diplomacy accompanied rearmament. The most significant alliance emerged with Tigranes II. Tigranes had constructed a powerful Armenian kingdom extending across parts of Syria and Mesopotamia. His territorial expansion created a buffer east of Pontus and a counterweight to Roman influence. The alliance was reinforced through dynastic marriage, integrating Pontic and Armenian interests. According to Appian, this partnership provided Mithridates with a potential refuge and military reinforcement should direct confrontation resume. The alliance altered the regional balance. Rome had previously confronted Pontus as an isolated monarchy. With Armenian support, Mithridates could extend conflict beyond Anatolia. The mountainous terrain connecting Pontus and Armenia facilitated coordinated defense. Moreover, Armenian cavalry forces offered mobility across eastern theaters. This strategic depth complicated Roman planning and increased the potential scale of future war. Meanwhile, Roman administration in Asia underwent reorganization following Sulla's constitutional reforms. Sulla sought to stabilize senatorial authority after years of civil conflict. Provincial governance was tightened through clearer lines of command and fiscal oversight. However, the financial burdens imposed after the First Mithridatic War remained significant. Cities that had supported Mithridates were required to pay heavy indemnities. According to Appian, collective fines were levied across the province to compensate Roman losses. Economic strain persisted. Inscriptions from Western Anatolia reference debt settlements and financial obligations during this period. The presence of public ani continued, though senatorial supervision increased. The combination of indemnities and renewed tax collection generated tension within urban communities. While Roman military control had been restored, political loyalty was not uniformly secured. Rome did not undertake immediate eastern expansion after 81 BCE. Domestic consolidation remained a priority. However, Roman commanders monitored Pontic activity closely. Diplomatic exchanges between Rome and Pontus continued intermittently, though mutual suspicion dominated. No formal revision of the Peace of Dardanus occurred. The settlement remained legally intact yet strategically unstable. These years functioned as a period of recalibration rather than peace. Mithridates strengthened defenses, expanded naval forces, and secured a powerful eastern ally. Rome reorganized provincial administration and reasserted fiscal control. Neither side demobilized fully. Instead, both prepared for contingencies. Material evidence from the Black Sea region supports the narrative of sustained activity. Coin hoards dated to the late 80s and early 70s BCE indicate continued military expenditure and economic circulation under Pontic authority. Fortified sites show phases of reinforcement rather than abandonment. Such patterns reflect anticipation of renewed hostilities rather than confidence in lasting stability. The geopolitical landscape of Anatolia thus remained divided. Western territories were integrated into Roman provincial systems, albeit under economic pressure. Eastern Anatolia and the Black Sea coast formed a militarized Pontic sphere reinforced by Armenian alliance. The frontier between these zones represented a latent fault line. By 75 BCE, the conditions for renewed conflict were firmly established. Military capacity had been restored, alliances secured, and administrative reforms implemented on both sides. Yet no direct confrontation had resumed. The decisive catalyst would emerge not from incremental border tension, but from dynastic transformation in a neighboring kingdom whose fate would once again draw Rome and Pontus into open war. Ewell, deposited in Rome, ignited the largest eastern war of the late Republic. The transformation of Bithynia from client kingdom to Roman province altered the strategic equilibrium of northern Anatolia and forced a decisive response from Pontus. In 74 BCE, Nicomedes IV died without a secure heir. His reign had been marked by dependence on Roman support. Earlier succession disputes had required senatorial arbitration, reinforcing Bithynia's status as a client monarchy aligned with Roman interests. According to Appian, Nicomedes bequeathed his kingdom to the Roman Republic in his will. This act followed precedent established decades earlier by Attalus III of Pergamon. Testamentary transfer allowed Rome to expand influence without immediate conquest. The Roman Senate accepted the inheritance. Bithynia was reorganized as a Roman province, often administered jointly with the province of Asia in its early phase. Roman magistrates were assigned authority over taxation, judicial proceedings, and military oversight. The annexation extended Roman territorial control to the southern shores of the Black Sea and brought the frontier closer to Pontic lands. Unlike indirect alliance, provincial status entailed permanent Roman administrative presence. Geographically, Bithynia occupied a strategic corridor. Its coastal cities, including Nicomedia and Chalcedon, commanded access to the Propontis and the straits linking the Black Sea with the Aegean. Inland routes connected Anatolia's northern plateau with western markets. For Pontus, Roman control of Bithynia represented more than diplomatic alignment. It signaled territorial encirclement. Trade flowing from Pontic ports toward Mediterranean markets could now be intercepted or regulated by Roman authorities. From the Roman perspective, annexation secured stability along a volatile frontier. Bithynia had experienced repeated internal unrest and external pressure. Direct administration promised clearer fiscal extraction and reduced reliance on fragile dynastic legitimacy. Senate debates likely considered both economic opportunity and strategic necessity. The region's agricultural productivity and maritime position offered revenue and naval staging advantages. For Mithridates VI, the development confirmed long-standing concerns. Roman authority had already extended across western Anatolia following the bequest of Pergamon. With Bithynia absorbed, Pontus faced Roman provinces along its southwestern and western borders. The buffer provided by client monarchies was disappearing. The balance that had allowed intermittent coexistence now tilted decisively toward Rome. Ancient accounts suggest that Mithridates interpreted the annexation as an existential threat. Appian reports that he considered Roman expansion incompatible with Pontic sovereignty. Military mobilization began soon after news of the bequest reached him. Garrisons were reinforced, and naval forces were prepared for rapid deployment. The strategic calculations differed from those preceding earlier wars. Instead of responding to provocation or border disputes, Mithridates confronted permanent Roman territorial encroachment. The Roman transition in Bithynia was administrative rather than militarized at the outset. No immediate large-scale garrison accompanied annexation. As in earlier expansions, Rome relied on provincial governors with limited standing forces. This approach reflected confidence in Roman deterrence and in the stability of allied territories. However, it also created vulnerability during transitional phases. The infrastructure of governance required time to consolidate. Economic implications were equally significant. Integration into the Roman provincial system meant the extension of tax farming contracts and judicial circuits. Bithynian elites who had previously operated within monarchical frameworks now faced senatorial oversight. The shift may have generated uncertainty among local aristocracy. Inscriptions from the region indicate adjustments in civic administration during the early 70s BCE, consistent with provincial restructuring. Mithridates moved before the new province could stabilize. In 74 BCE, Pontic forces crossed into Bithynian territory. The invasion targeted key urban centers and supply routes. By acting swiftly, Mithridates sought to disrupt Roman consolidation and reassert influence over the region. The campaign differed in scale from Murina's limited incursions years earlier. This time, the objective extended beyond border adjustment. It aimed at reversing annexation. Early engagements favored Pontic forces. Roman commanders stationed in Asia were not yet reinforced by major consular armies. Pontic troops advanced westward, seizing territory and rallying opposition to Roman rule. The speed of the campaign suggests prior logistical preparation. Supply lines from the Black Sea coast and interior Anatolia supported sustained operations. Naval elements secured coastal movements. The invasion transformed the political character of the conflict. Unlike earlier wars triggered by specific disputes, this confrontation centered on the structural question of Roman expansion. If Bithynia remained under Roman administration, Pontus would operate within a constricted sphere. If Roman authority could be expelled, the regional balance might be restored. The stakes were therefore territorial and systemic rather than episodic. Roman reaction required escalation. Provincial governors lacked sufficient forces to repel a determined invasion. Reports of Pontic advances reached Rome amid ongoing domestic political competition. The Senate faced the necessity of appointing a commander with expanded authority and resources. Precedents for extraordinary commands had already been established in earlier crises. Material evidence from Bithynian sites reflects disruption layers consistent with renewed warfare. Coin hoards buried during this period suggest insecurity and rapid changes in control. While not all cities resisted Pontic occupation, the sudden shift underscores the instability of newly annexed provinces during military transition. The bequest of Bithynia thus functioned as the catalyst for the Third Mithridatic War. A legal inheritance transformed into armed confrontation. Rome's reliance on testamentary expansion intersected with Pontic determination to prevent strategic isolation. The conflict that followed would exceed the scope of earlier wars in duration, geography, and political consequence. By the close of 74 BCE, open war had resumed on a scale neither side could easily contain. The Roman Republic, compelled to defend its newest province, would respond not with limited provincial forces but with a commander entrusted with broader authority and long-term campaign objectives. Initial victories masked deeper structural weaknesses within Mithridates' coalition. The invasion of Bithynia in 74 BCE appeared, at first, to replicate the dramatic successes of the First Mithridatic War. Roman administration in the region was new and fragile. Provincial infrastructure was incomplete. Local grievances toward tax collection and Roman judicial oversight created an atmosphere in which Pontic intervention could be framed as liberation rather than aggression. Mithridates VI advanced rapidly across Bithynian territory. His army included Pontic regulars, allied contingents from Anatolia, cavalry drawn from eastern client rulers, and a fleet capable of contesting coastal control. Urban centers such as Nicomedia were threatened or compelled into submission. The speed of the campaign prevented coordinated Roman resistance. Provincial commanders lacked the manpower to confront a prepared invasion. The strategic objective in these opening operations was twofold. First, Mithridates sought to dismantle the newly created Roman province before administrative consolidation could occur. Second, he aimed to stimulate broader revolt within Asia Minor by presenting himself as a defender of regional autonomy against Roman annexation. The memory of the earlier massacres of Roman residents during the First War still lingered, and although Mithridates did not replicate that policy immediately, his presence rekindled anti-Roman sentiment in some cities. Yet beneath these successes lay structural vulnerabilities. Mithridates' coalition relied on diverse allies with varying motivations. Some were motivated by fear of Roman taxation. Others sought territorial advantage. Still others maintained pragmatic neutrality. Unlike the unified Roman command structure, Pontic coordination depended heavily on the personal authority of the king. As the campaign extended, sustaining cohesion across distant fronts would prove increasingly difficult. Rome's response came swiftly. In 74 BCE, the Senate assigned command to Lucius Licinius Lucullus, who was granted the proconsular authority necessary to confront the expanding conflict. Lucullus had served under Sulla and possessed experience in Eastern affairs. Though sometimes overshadowed by later commanders in popular memory, his early leadership in this war proved decisive. Lucullus inherited a precarious situation. Roman forces in Asia were scattered, morale was uncertain, and supply networks required reconstruction. Rather than immediately seeking pitched battle, Lucullus prioritized stabilization. He secured coastal strongholds, reorganized taxation to restore provincial confidence, and began rebuilding naval capacity. Control of the sea would be essential if Rome were to limit Pontic mobility. Naval reconstruction marked a significant turning point. Mithridates' fleet had historically allowed rapid coastal movement and logistical flexibility. By reasserting maritime control, Lucullus constrained Pontic supply lines and reduced the threat of amphibious operations. Roman ships, constructed or requisitioned from allied ports, gradually regained dominance in the Propontis and Aegean corridors. On land, Lucullus emphasized discipline and logistical preparation. Roman legions, when adequately supplied and coordinated, possessed structural advantages over composite armies. Standardized equipment, fortified marching camps, and strict command hierarchy ensured resilience even in hostile terrain. Rather than dispersing his forces, Lucullus concentrated them to prevent defeat in detail. The first major confrontations demonstrated the difference between rapid expansion and sustained warfare. Pontic forces, though formidable in cavalry and missile troops, struggled to maintain cohesion in prolonged engagements against entrenched legions. Roman engineering, field fortifications, siegecraft, and road construction enabled controlled advances rather than impulsive offensives. As the campaign progressed, Mithridates shifted strategy. Instead of risking annihilation in direct confrontation, he withdrew eastward, drawing Roman forces deeper into Anatolia. This maneuver had strategic logic. Pontus' mountainous interior offered defensive advantages and shorter supply lines. However, retreat also signaled the limits of early momentum. Lucullus pursued cautiously. His approach combined attrition with containment. Rather than overstretching his army, he secured recaptured territory and ensured lines of communication remained intact. Cities previously swayed by Pontic success recalibrated allegiance as Roman stability returned. The conflict thus evolved from regional uprising to structured interstate war. Financial resources played a central role in this transition. Rome's provincial system, despite inefficiencies, could mobilize substantial revenue once secured. Mithridates relied heavily on royal treasuries and allied contributions. Prolonged campaigning strained these reserves. Coinage from the period indicates increased minting to fund operations, suggesting fiscal pressure. A decisive episode occurred during the siege of Cyzicus, where Mithridates attempted to trap Roman forces but instead found his own army suffering from supply shortages and disease. Lucullus avoided reckless engagement, allowing environmental and logistical factors to weaken the Pontic host. The episode demonstrated Roman strategic patience. Rather than seeking immediate glory, Lucullus leveraged structural superiority. The psychological dimension of these campaigns should not be underestimated. Early Pontic victories had projected confidence. Yet as Roman resistance solidified, the narrative shifted. Local elites increasingly viewed Roman governance as durable. Mithridates' appeal as liberator diminished when sustained occupation proved difficult. By 73 BCE, the war's geography had expanded significantly. Fighting moved beyond Bithynia into deeper Anatolian territory. Roman columns advanced methodically, capturing strongholds and severing Pontic supply networks. Each withdrawal by Mithridates pushed the theater eastward, transforming what began as a defense of Bithynia into a broader struggle for dominance in the Near East. The structural contrast between the two powers became clearer. Rome's military machine, though often slow to mobilize, excelled in protracted operations. Its legions could endure attrition and adapt to terrain. Mithridates possessed tactical brilliance and charismatic authority, but sustaining a multi-front coalition required resources that even Pontus found difficult to maintain indefinitely. As Pontic forces retreated toward their homeland, the conflict assumed a new dimension. The struggle no longer centered solely on Roman provincial integrity, but on the survival of Pontic sovereignty itself. Mithridates sought external support to offset Roman pressure. Diplomatic ties with Armenia would soon draw another major kingdom into the war. The opening campaigns therefore illustrate a critical transformation. What began as a rapid strike against a newly annexed province evolved into a methodical confrontation between organized states. Initial victories, though dramatic, could not compensate for a logistical imbalance. The Roman Republic demonstrated that disciplined coordination and maritime control could neutralize early setbacks. The war ceased to be Anatolian. It became Near Eastern. When Mithridates VI retreated eastward under pressure from Roman advances, the strategic center of gravity shifted decisively. Pontus alone could no longer sustain prolonged resistance against a methodical Roman offensive. Survival required external reinforcement. That reinforcement lay beyond the Euphrates, in the expanding dominion of his son-in-law, Tigranes II. The alliance between Mithridates and Tigranes was not improvised in crisis. It rested upon dynastic marriage and long-standing diplomatic coordination. Tigranes had married Mithridates' daughter, cementing a political bond that intertwined Pontic and Armenian interests. By the 70s BCE, Tigranes had constructed a territorial empire extending far beyond the Armenian highlands. His authority reached into northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and portions of Cilicia. Client rulers acknowledged his supremacy. Royal titulature adopted increasingly expansive claims. Armenia under Tigranes had evolved into a regional power capable of rivaling Seleucid successors and challenging Parthian influence. The weakening of Seleucid authority in Syria allowed Tigranes to occupy major urban centers with limited resistance. This expansion transformed Armenia from a highland kingdom into a transregional empire. Control over trade corridors linking Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant enhanced fiscal capacity. When Mithridates arrived seeking refuge, he brought not merely personal safety concerns but the continuation of a war that now threatened Roman dominance in the east. Roman commander Lucullus had demonstrated operational superiority in Anatolia. Pontic forces had retreated through Cappadocia and into their eastern territories. Continued resistance required terrain, manpower, and financial depth beyond Pontus' shrinking base. Tigranes initially approached the request with caution. Surrendering Mithridates to Rome might have secured temporary accommodation. However, doing so would signal weakness and undermine dynastic alliance. Moreover, Roman expansion into Bithynia and Asia suggested that Armenian autonomy could eventually face similar encroachment. Accepting Mithridates reinforced a defensive posture against perceived Roman overreach. The refusal to extradite Mithridates effectively transformed a bilateral war into a multi-kingdom confrontation. Roman diplomatic envoys demanded surrender. Armenian refusal provided justification for expanded Roman objectives. What had begun as a provincial defense in Bithynia now widened into a confrontation with one of the largest Near Eastern monarchies of the era. Armenian military organization differed significantly from Pontic and Roman structures. The backbone of Tigranes' field army consisted of heavy cavalry, cataphracts equipped with full-body armor for both rider and horse. These units were designed for shock engagement, capable of breaking lighter infantry formations through concentrated charge. Supporting contingents included archers, light infantry from subject regions, and auxiliary forces drawn from newly incorporated territories. Urban infrastructure also reflected imperial ambition. Tigranes had founded a new capital, Tigranocerta, constructed to symbolize centralized authority and imperial prestige. The city served administrative, military, and symbolic functions. Populations were reportedly relocated from conquered territories to populate its districts, reinforcing both economic vitality and political control. Fortifications emphasized defensive resilience, anticipating external challenge. The Armenian highlands themselves provided strategic depth. Mountainous terrain, narrow passes, and limited road networks complicated invasion. Roman forces accustomed to Mediterranean campaigning would confront extended supply lines and unfamiliar climatic conditions. The further east the war moved, the more tenuous Roman logistics would become. Yet structural challenges accompanied Armenian expansion. Rapid territorial growth required integrating diverse populations with varying loyalties. Subject cities in Syria and Mesopotamia had only recently accepted Armenian authority. Their commitment to prolonged war against Rome was uncertain. Imperial scale did not necessarily equate to cohesive administrative integration. Mithridates' presence at the Armenian court introduced both strategic coordination and potential tension. As an experienced opponent of Rome, he offered counsel shaped by decades of conflict. His perspective emphasized mobility, coalition warfare, and exploitation of Roman overextension. Tigranes, whose empire had grown through calculated expansion rather than sustained confrontation with Rome, faced a strategic choice: negotiate from strength or commit to open resistance. Roman leadership interpreted Armenian refusal as a direct challenge. Lucullus' authority extended beyond defensive containment. If Armenia sheltered Rome's primary adversary, then Armenia became a legitimate theater of war. This interpretation aligned with Roman strategic doctrine: neutralize hostile coalitions before they consolidate. Diplomatic exchanges deteriorated into preparations for invasion. Roman intelligence assessed Armenian troop concentrations and supply depots. Meanwhile, Armenian mobilization accelerated. Cataphract contingents assembled alongside levies from Syria and northern Mesopotamia. The war's geography expanded from Anatolia's coastal plains to the uplands and river valleys of the Near East. The transformation carried symbolic weight. The confrontation now pitted Roman Republican legions against a Hellenistic-style imperial monarchy claiming trans-regional authority. Political messaging on both sides adapted accordingly. Roman narratives framed the campaign as necessary to eliminate a destabilizing alliance. Armenian proclamations emphasized sovereignty and dynastic honor. Strategically, Mithridates' relocation achieved immediate survival but forfeited autonomy. Pontic operations were now embedded within Armenian strategic calculations. The alliance provided manpower and territory but required coordinated command. Differences in military culture, Roman discipline, Pontic adaptability, Armenian cavalry emphasis would shape forthcoming engagements. Economic considerations further influenced decision-making. Armenia's control over trade routes connecting the Euphrates basin to Mediterranean markets supplied revenue for prolonged mobilization. However, sustaining large cavalry forces required continuous provisioning of fodder and equipment. Extended campaigns risked draining fiscal reserves, especially if Roman forces disrupted key corridors. By 69 BCE, Roman strategy shifted decisively toward offensive penetration. Lucullus prepared to cross into Armenian territory despite the logistical risk. His calculations rested on speed and surprise. Rather than allowing Tigranes to consolidate a massive field army, he aimed to strike before full mobilization matured. The initiative thus passed to Rome. The alliance between Mithridates and Tigranes redefined the war's scale. What began as resistance to provincial annexation evolved into a contest over Near Eastern hegemony. Roman legions would soon confront Armenian cataphracts and fortified capitals. The decision to shelter Mithridates eliminated diplomatic ambiguity and clarified the conflict stakes. The coming campaigns would test whether Armenian depth and cavalry shock could withstand Roman infantry cohesion and siegecraft. The battlefield would shift from Anatolia's plains to the environs of Tigranocerta. There, imperial ambition and republican expansion would collide in one of the defining engagements of the Third Mithridatic War. Against overwhelming numbers, Roman cohesion prevailed. In 69 BCE, Lucius Licinius Lucullus carried the war beyond Anatolia and into the Armenian heartland. His decision to invade the dominions of Tigranes II represented one of the boldest operational gambits of the late Roman Republic. The objective was clear: compel Armenia to abandon its alliance with Mithridates VI by striking directly at its political center. The target was Tigranocerta, Tigranes' newly founded capital. Situated in northern Mesopotamia, the city symbolized Armenian imperial ambition. It had been populated through forced resettlements from conquered territories and fortified to reflect royal authority. By attacking Tigranocerta, Lucullus aimed not only at military victory but at psychological disruption. A successful siege would undermine the legitimacy of Armenian expansion. Lucullus's advance required calculated risk. Roman forces, estimated by ancient sources at approximately 12,000 to 15,000 infantry with supporting cavalry, marched deep into hostile terrain. Supply lines stretched across difficult highlands. The Armenian king, by contrast, commanded a substantially larger host. Classical accounts, particularly that of Appian, inflate Armenian numbers to dramatic proportions, sometimes exceeding 70,000 or even 100,000 troops. Modern scholarship treats such figures cautiously, but numerical superiority on the Armenian side is broadly accepted. The Armenian army reflected imperial diversity. Heavy cavalry cataphracts formed its elite striking arm. These armored horsemen were designed to shatter enemy formations through concentrated charge. Supporting them were archers, light infantry, and contingents drawn from recently incorporated Syrian and Mesopotamian territories. The size and composition of the army projected power, but cohesion across linguistic and regional lines remained uncertain. Lucullus initiated the siege before Tigranes fully concentrated his field army. Roman siegecraft had long been a structural advantage. Fortified camps, circumvallation lines, and disciplined engineering units allowed Roman forces to impose pressure even against large urban centers. As the siege progressed, Tigranes advanced to relieve the city. Ancient narratives emphasized the king's confidence upon observing the comparatively small Roman force. According to Appian, Tigranes reportedly dismissed the Romans as too few to be ambassadors and too many to be scouts. Whether apocryphal or authentic, the anecdote reflects perceived numerical imbalance. Lucullus faced a critical decision: continue the siege and risk encirclement, or confront the approaching army in open battle. He chose engagement. Roman tactical doctrine relied on disciplined infantry formations capable of adapting to battlefield developments. Legionaries were trained to maintain cohesion under pressure, construct field defenses rapidly, and exploit terrain. The battlefield near Tigranocerta offered limited maneuvering space due to surrounding hills and river courses. Lucullus exploited elevation, positioning his troops to disrupt the Armenian cavalry's charge. Rather than confronting cataphracts head-on in flat terrain, where shock impact could prove devastating, he aimed to fragment their formation. When Armenian cavalry advanced, Roman infantry held formation. Heavy shields and tight ranks absorbed initial momentum. At critical moments, Roman units targeted the flanks and less protected elements of the cavalry line. Discipline in maintaining formation proved decisive. Once Armenian cavalry cohesion faltered, the numerical advantage became less effective. Simultaneously, Roman forces launched coordinated assaults on Armenian infantry contingents. Without synchronized support from cavalry, these units struggled to mount sustained resistance. Panic spread unevenly across the coalition army. The diversity that symbolized Armenian imperial reach now contributed to breakdown in unified command. The collapse accelerated rapidly. Once cataphract formations disintegrated, retreat turned into rout. Roman pursuit compounded losses. Ancient sources describe significant Armenian casualties, though precise numbers remain uncertain. What is clear is that the engagement ended decisively in Roman favor. The aftermath extended beyond battlefield casualties. Tigranocerta, deprived of effective relief, fell to Roman forces. Segments of the city's population reportedly opened gates or offered minimal resistance. The fall of the capital destabilized Armenian authority in newly conquered territories. Subject populations, particularly in Syria and Mesopotamia, reassessed allegiance. For Lucullus, the victory demonstrated the enduring effectiveness of Roman legionary cohesion against numerically superior foes. Tactical flexibility, terrain exploitation, and disciplined command offset disadvantage in manpower. The battle joined earlier Republican precedents, such as Cynocephaly and Magnesia, where structured infantry formations defeated larger Hellenistic armies. Yet the triumph did not eliminate Armenian capacity for resistance. Tigranes survived the engagement and retained control over core highland territories. His empire, though shaken, was not dismantled. Moreover, Mithridates remained at large, continuing to advise and coordinate resistance. Logistically, Lucullus faced mounting strain. Deep penetration into Armenia stretched supply lines across mountainous terrain. Roman troops, though victorious, endured harsh climatic conditions and limited provisioning. Extended campaigning without clear termination risked morale decline. Reports of dissatisfaction among soldiers began to surface in subsequent months. Politically, developments in Rome complicated the strategic picture. Lucullus' prolonged eastern command intersected with domestic rivalries. Success on the battlefield did not automatically translate into sustained political support. Opponents questioned the necessity of further advance, especially as immediate threats to Roman provinces appeared neutralized. The Battle of Tigranocerta therefore achieved operational and symbolic success but fell short of decisive strategic resolution. It fractured Armenian imperial prestige and demonstrated Roman battlefield superiority. However, it did not capture Tigranes nor eliminate Mithridates. Resistance shifted rather than ceased. Subsequent campaigning pushed further into Armenian territory, including movement toward Artaxata. Yet each additional mile increased logistical complexity. Roman forces operated far from established provincial bases. Local geography favored defensive regrouping by Armenian and Pontic elements. From a broader analytical perspective, Tigranocerta illustrates the limits of battlefield victory in coalition warfare. Numerical superiority without unified command proved vulnerable. At the same time, tactical excellence without sustainable logistics struggled to secure permanent settlement. The confrontation revealed both Roman strength and the constraints of extended eastern campaigning. Against overwhelming numbers, Roman cohesion prevailed. Yet victory on the field did not immediately translate into comprehensive strategic closure. Armenian resistance persisted in core territories, and Mithridates remained an active adversary. The war, though reshaped, was not concluded. In the wake of Tigranocerta, Rome confronted a paradox. It had demonstrated supremacy, yet had not secured finality. The conflict would continue, shaped by shifting alliances, political recalculations in Rome, and the enduring resilience of its eastern opponents. Military success abroad faltered under political rivalry at home. By the early 60s BCE, the eastern campaigns waged by Lucius Licinius Lucullus had extended far beyond the initial objective of securing Bithynia and restraining Mithridates VI. Victories at Tigranocerta and subsequent engagements had demonstrated Roman tactical superiority, yet they had not concluded the war. Instead, Roman legions found themselves operating deep within unfamiliar Anatolian and Armenian terrain, confronting logistical challenges and environmental hardships that slowly eroded discipline and morale. The Roman military system relied on seasonal campaigning and relatively short rotations. Legions were organized for operational flexibility but required reliable supply lines, local provisioning, and periodic rotation to maintain cohesion. Lucullus' forces, advancing into Armenia and Pontic territories, faced mountains, rivers, and harsh winter conditions. Foraging proved difficult, while extended supply chains from Asia Minor strained both transport and local populations. Ancient inscriptions from Pontic regions indicate ongoing requisitioning of grain, fodder, and material, corroborating textual reports of resource pressure. Extended deployment began to produce visible fatigue among the troops. Roman soldiers, though experienced and disciplined, were far from their homelands. Letters and accounts suggest that letters sent to Rome complained of inadequate provisions, exposure to disease, and the monotony of long campaigns. Disease outbreaks, particularly dysentery and respiratory illnesses common in highland Anatolia, further weakened manpower. Operational tempo had slowed, with campaigns marked by caution and attrition rather than rapid, decisive engagement. Lucullus' strategic approach, emphasizing methodical siegecraft, fortification, and patience, had achieved tactical victories but inadvertently contributed to dissatisfaction. Legionaries accustomed to shorter, decisive campaigns perceived extended occupation and minor skirmishes as less honorable than pitched battles. Reports by contemporary historians, including Plutarch, emphasized the psychological strain imposed by campaigning across rugged terrain under sustained threat. Soldiers' expectations of glory and spoils often conflicted with the realities of protracted warfare. Political interference in Rome compounded the problem. Lucullus' success provoked envy and rivalry among other senators and generals. Opponents criticized his prolonged command, framing it as personal ambition rather than service to the Republic. Political factions leveraged reports of troop dissatisfaction to undermine his authority. Unlike earlier periods of Roman history, when battlefield success alone sufficed to legitimize command, the late Republic demanded ongoing political validation from the Senate. This dual pressure, operational fatigue and political opposition, manifested in overt disciplinary challenges. Mutinous behavior began to surface among senior centurions and legionaries. Soldiers occasionally refused orders for advance into Armenia or threatened withdrawal without clear direction from their general. Plutarch notes instances of insubordination and protests over delayed payment, which Roman commanders historically viewed as signs of deteriorating cohesion. The strategic implications were significant. The inability to compel compliance in the field reduced operational flexibility, constrained offensive options, and delayed engagement with remaining Pontic and Armenian forces. Each postponement allowed Mithridates and Tigranes to regroup, reinforce, and exploit terrain advantages. The advantage gained at Tigranocerta began to erode as Roman momentum slowed. The Roman Senate monitored these developments closely. Reports of mutiny, delayed campaigns, and increasing troop complaints raised concerns that the war could stall entirely. In an era of interlinked political and military authority, extended operational deployment without visible strategic gains created openings for rival commanders to assert influence. Lucullus' enemies in Rome portrayed his command as increasingly ineffective, framing tactical successes as overshadowed by logistical and disciplinary failures. Economically, prolonged campaigning strained Rome's provincial extraction system. Supplies intended for legions placed additional burdens on local populations. Taxation and requisitioning, necessary to sustain extended deployment, provoked resentment and occasional local resistance. Letters and inscriptions from Asia Minor cities document the collection of grain, livestock, and coinage for the war effort, underscoring the stress imposed on both soldiers and civilians. In response, Lucullus attempted administrative and tactical remedies. He organized systematic rotations where feasible, enforced camp discipline rigorously, and delegated authority to trusted legates. Naval forces were reinforced to secure supply lines along coastal Anatolia, mitigating the risk of overland disruption. Despite these measures, fundamental challenges remained. The physical distance from Italy, combined with persistent winter campaigns and complex political dynamics, limited their effectiveness. Mutiny and troop dissatisfaction also had morale consequences. Soldiers' confidence in leadership can deteriorate when extended operations lack immediate and tangible success. For legions accustomed to regular spoils and decisive victories, the incremental gains achieved against Armenian and Pontic forces could not compensate for environmental hardship and uncertainty. Centurions' authority eroded when soldiers openly questioned orders, forcing Lucullus to manage both battlefield tactics and internal cohesion simultaneously. The culmination of these pressures created a political and operational impasse. Lucullus retained the capacity to engage Pontic and Armenian forces, but his freedom of maneuver was constrained. The Senate's scrutiny, combined with factional intrigue, further weakened his ability to enforce extended campaigns. Pontus and Armenia observed these developments, interpreting them as potential openings to regroup and challenge Roman authority in subsequent operations. Ultimately, the combination of campaign fatigue, supply difficulties, and political rivalry demonstrated the limits of Roman operational endurance in protracted Eastern conflicts. Tactical success alone could not secure strategic closure. The effectiveness of legionary discipline and siegecraft faced erosion when logistics and morale deteriorated, highlighting structural constraints in extended foreign campaigns. By 66 BCE, it became apparent that a new solution was required. The Senate sought a commander with the political stature, experience, and resources to restore momentum and secure decisive results. The mutinous legions and encumbered campaigns of Lucullus underscored the necessity of extraordinary command, paving the way for the rise of a figure already dominant in Mediterranean warfare. Rome's focus shifted toward a decisive intervention capable of ending resistance by Pontus and Armenia alike. Extraordinary command became Rome's solution to extraordinary resistance. By 66 BCE, the protracted campaigns in the eastern provinces had exposed the limits of traditional Roman command structures. Lucullus, despite tactical brilliance at Tigranocerta and subsequent engagements, faced exhausted legions, supply challenges, and mounting political opposition at home. The Roman Senate, influenced by both public concern and senatorial rivalry, sought a decisive solution to conclude the war against Mithridates VI and Tigranes II. The solution emerged through a legal instrument unprecedented in scope, the Lex Manilia. Proposed by the tribune Gaius Manilius, the law aimed to transfer supreme command in the eastern provinces to Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompey, already renowned for campaigns in the Mediterranean, including operations against piracy and successes in Hispania and Sicily, possessed the military experience and political weight necessary to stabilize the Eastern Front. The Lex Manilia extended proconsular imperium, granting him authority over all Roman forces in the region, alongside administrative oversight of newly acquired provinces. The proposal generated intense political debate. Cicero, then serving as a prominent orator and statesman, delivered the speech known as the Pro Leg Manilia, advocating for Pompey's appointment. He argued that the complexity and scale of the Mithridatic conflict exceeded the capacity of ordinary consular command, emphasizing both the need for unified leadership and the extraordinary capabilities of Pompey. Cicero's rhetoric highlighted the strategic danger posed by divided Roman authority and the opportunity presented by a commander with proven organizational skill. Opposition, primarily from conservative senators wary of concentrating power in a single individual, framed the transfer as a potential threat to the Republic's norms. Critics feared precedent. Granting extraordinary authority for prolonged duration risked undermining traditional checks on magisterial power. Despite these concerns, popular and senatorial support coalesced, recognizing the practical necessity of decisive intervention. The law passed, and Pompey assumed command with unprecedented legal and operational authority. Upon assuming control, Pompey inherited not only the remnants of Lucullus' forces but also the strategic and administrative framework of the eastern provinces. Legions were fatigued yet experienced, supply networks partially restored, and provincial governance partially stabilized. The transfer of authority allowed for a centralization of command, streamlining decision-making, and resolving the coordination difficulties that had plagued earlier operations. Pompey's organizational strategy emphasized comprehensive assessment. He conducted surveys of troop readiness, fortifications, and logistical capacity across Asia Minor, Cappadocia, and the Pontic frontier. Roman intelligence on Pontic and Armenian dispositions, though imperfect, was systematically compiled. Provincial governors reported urban populations, fortifications, and economic resources, enabling Pompey to prioritize objectives and sequence campaigns effectively. A key aspect of the transfer involved legal consolidation. Pompey was authorized not only to command armies but also to oversee provincial administration, judicial authority, and taxation in territories impacted by the war. This integration facilitated both operational efficiency and political legitimacy. Governors and local elites now operated under the direction of a single authority capable of coordinating military and civic measures simultaneously. Strategically, Pompey faced two central challenges: neutralizing Mithridates' remaining forces in Anatolia and Pontus, and compelling Tigranes to relinquish his eastern territories or submit to Roman authority. Both objectives required synchronization of land and naval forces. Pompey prioritized reorganization of the fleet, critical for controlling the Black Sea coast and ensuring logistical access to Pontic and Anatolian cities. Shipbuilding programs expanded coastal garrisons, while reconnaissance units monitored key supply routes. Rome's fiscal and manpower resources, previously dispersed among competing provincial commands, were now fully available under Pompey. The proconsul implemented strict rotational schedules to mitigate prior campaign fatigue among legions. Supply depots were established in central Anatolia, and garrison posts reinforced in critical towns such as Nicomedia, Amycia, and Sinope. The structural emphasis on organization and infrastructure aimed to prevent the logistical vulnerabilities that had previously hindered Roman campaigns. On the diplomatic front, Pompey leveraged both intimidation and negotiation. Regional rulers, previously aligned with Pontus or Armenia, were presented with the choice of submission or destruction. Envoys were dispatched to neighboring kingdoms, client cities, and urban elites, offering protection under Roman authority in exchange for recognition and tribute. These measures expanded Rome's sphere of influence without immediate recourse to combat, allowing military operations to focus on principal enemy forces. Mithridates, observing the transfer of command, recognized the heightened threat. Pompey's experience, logistical acumen, and legal authority represented a systemic shift in Roman capability. Previously, Pontus had benefited from fragmented Roman oversight, delays in reinforcement, and political uncertainty. Under Pompey, these advantages were largely negated. The king initiated renewed defensive preparations, reinforcing fortifications and coordinating remaining forces with Armenian allies. Tigranes likewise reassessed his position. The extension of Roman authority into Armenia's western frontier, coupled with Pompey's reputation, posed a clear strategic threat. While Tigranes' army remained formidable, the consolidation of Roman command introduced a level of operational coherence absent in earlier campaigns. Armenian attempts at coalition warfare would face a commander with superior coordination of both land and naval elements. The enactment of the Lex Manilia thus marked both a legal and operational turning point. Politically, it signaled Rome's willingness to grant extraordinary powers to address extraordinary challenges. Militarily, it allowed for unified strategic planning, systematic resource allocation, and decisive operational tempo. The groundwork was laid for a campaign aimed not at episodic victories but at comprehensive elimination of Pontic and Armenian resistance. In practical terms, Pompey prioritized the systematic sequencing of campaigns. He divided the theater into operational zones, assigning subordinate commanders to secure supply lines and maintain order in recently recovered cities. Legions were reinforced where necessary, and artillery, siege equipment, and engineering corps were deployed to ensure that future sieges could be conducted efficiently. Pontic and Armenian strongholds, previously difficult to approach due to fragmented Roman command, were now threatened simultaneously by coordinated movements. Roman political messaging reinforced the legitimacy of Pompey's authority. Public ceremonies, coinage, and Senate decrees emphasized his extraordinary command as a necessary response to the exceptional threat posed by Mithridates and Tigranes. Such measures reinforced both internal cohesion within the legions and compliance among provincial populations. The integration of political and military authority under a single figure exemplified the late Republican approach to resolving crises through extraordinary magistracies. The immediate effect was operational clarity. Units that previously reported through overlapping chains of command now followed a coherent hierarchy. Supply depots, reconnaissance units, and field armies were synchronized. Siege plans and offensive campaigns could be executed without delay, allowing Roman forces to capitalize on the structural weaknesses that had developed within Pontic and Armenian coalition forces over years of intermittent conflict. By consolidating command under Pompey, Rome effectively transitioned the war from a protracted, episodic struggle into a methodically managed campaign aimed at total resolution. Mithridates' previous reliance on mobility, coalition building, and regional leverage faced a new reality: an adversary with unmatched coordination, legal authority, and operational flexibility. The transfer of command set the stage for decisive Roman operations across Anatolia, Pontus, and into the Armenian highlands. In conclusion, the Lex Manilia exemplified Rome's approach to extraordinary resistance. When conventional command structures failed, legislative innovation granted supreme authority to a single general. Pompey's assumption of command allowed for systematic organization, synchronized campaigns, and operational oversight capable of overcoming the structural and logistical challenges that had previously frustrated Roman efforts. With this extraordinary mandate, Pompey prepared to convert battlefield success into strategic closure, setting the stage for the final phases of the Mithridatic Wars. After decades of resistance, Mithridates' territorial base collapsed. In 66 BCE, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus decisively confronted Mithridates VI near the Lycus River in western Anatolia. Pompey had inherited a theater of war that extended across Asia Minor, Armenia, and the Pontic hinterlands. Previous Roman commanders had struggled with exhausted legions, stretched supply lines, and coalition armies that exploited local terrain. Pompey's extraordinary command, established under the Lex Manilia, allowed for unified operational planning, comprehensive logistics, and synchronized engagement across multiple fronts. Pontic forces, though formidable, faced structural disadvantages. Years of campaigning had depleted manpower, while prolonged conflict had strained the kingdom's fiscal and provisioning systems. Mithridates' reliance on alliances, particularly with Tigranes II, remained critical, but Armenian support was increasingly conditional and constrained by distance. Field armies were composed of a combination of native Pontic infantry, cavalry units drawn from Anatolia, and auxiliary contingents from allied territories, creating challenges for coordinated command. The engagement at the Lycus River illustrated Pompey's tactical and organizational superiority. Roman legions were arrayed in disciplined formations designed to absorb initial Pontic charges, particularly heavy cavalry and missile units. Pompey leveraged terrain advantage, positioning his forces to restrict mobility for the enemy and channel attacks into kill zones. Ancient sources, including Appian and Plutarch, emphasize that Roman tactical cohesion offset the Pontic numerical presence, enabling concentrated strikes at key weak points in the Pontic line. Initial contact demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman discipline against the experienced Pontic infantry. Mithridates' troops attempted traditional flanking maneuvers, while cavalry contingents sought to disrupt Roman formations. Roman cohesion and flexible command structure allowed rapid adjustment. Units reinforced threatened sectors while exploiting openings elsewhere. The Pontic army gradually fragmented under sustained pressure. Mithridates responded with strategic withdrawal, attempting to preserve his core forces while avoiding encirclement. However, Roman pursuit was systematic and relentless. Logistics, supply lines, and intelligence gathering ensured that retreating Pontic contingents could not regroup effectively. Ancient historians note that the speed of Roman advance prevented consolidation, limiting Mithridates' options for counterattack. The battle's outcome effectively ended organized Pontic resistance in Anatolia. Roman occupation of key cities, Amasia, Sinope, and Nicomedia, secured both strategic and economic control. Pompey implemented systematic reorganization of the territory, establishing provincial governance, garrisoning critical fortresses, and integrating administrative oversight. Pontic fiscal systems, previously oriented toward royal coffers and tribute networks, were replaced with Roman provincial structures, including standardized taxation and publicani financial administration. Mithridates' flight northward marked a transition from conventional warfare to pursuit and containment. He sought refuge in the Bosporan kingdom, ruled by his son and client allies along the northern Black Sea coast. While still a sovereign figure nominally controlling the kingdom, he was geographically isolated and politically constrained. The Pontic heartland, once the center of economic, military, and dynastic power, was now fully under Roman authority. Pompey's victory was not merely tactical. It represented systemic dismantling of Pontic territorial capacity. Cities previously loyal to Mithridates were either incorporated into Roman provinces or subordinated through client kingdoms. Infrastructure, fortifications, and administrative centers were realigned to serve Rome's strategic interests, ensuring that Pontus could no longer act as a coherent threat to eastern provinces. The defeat also had broader geopolitical implications. Neighboring kingdoms observed the efficiency of Roman organization, discipline, and administrative integration. Armenia's capacity to support Mithridates was implicitly constrained, highlighting the limitations of coalitional warfare against a unified opponent. Rome's projection of power now extended from the Aegean coast to the northern Black Sea frontier, demonstrating operational and strategic reach. Despite his loss, Mithridates remained active in the Black Sea region. From exile, he attempted to rebuild alliances, maintain naval capability, and preserve his claim to authority over Pontus. However, the structural resources required to challenge Rome, legion-level infantry, secure supply chains, and reliable regional alliances, were largely unavailable. His role shifted from king commanding a territory to a regional figure attempting to survive politically and militarily under increasingly unfavorable conditions. The aftermath of the Lycus engagement illustrates several key points about Roman military and administrative strategy. First, unified command under Pompey allowed for simultaneous operational, logistical, and administrative control, a contrast to the fragmented efforts of prior commanders. Second, disciplined and adaptable legions could neutralize numerically or geographically advantageous opponents. Third, Roman authority relied not solely on battlefield victory, but on post-conflict consolidation. Garrisoning, taxation, provincial governance, and client-state integration ensured permanent strategic effect. Mithridates' retreat to the Bosporan kingdom marked the end of Pontus as an independent power in Anatolia. The territorial collapse was comprehensive. Cities, fortifications, economic networks, and regional alliances had been systematically neutralized. While Mithridates continued to exist as a political figurehead, the Roman strategic objective, elimination of Pontic capacity to threaten eastern provinces, was achieved. By the conclusion of the 66 BCE campaign, the eastern Mediterranean theater had shifted decisively in Rome's favor. The operational superiority, logistical planning, and legal authority vested in Pompey enabled the final suppression of Mithridates' territorial base. The subsequent exile phase would define the last chapter of Mithridates' reign and underscore the enduring structural advantages of Roman Republican military organization when combined with extraordinary political authority. Victory was consolidated not by spectacle, but by administration. With Mithridates VI effectively neutralized in Anatolia, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus turned attention to the systematic consolidation of Roman authority across the eastern provinces. Military victories alone could not secure lasting stability. The integration of newly subdued territories required administrative restructuring, fiscal oversight, and control over trade networks. Pompey approached the task with the same methodical planning that had characterized his battlefield campaigns, recognizing that durable Roman dominance depended on governance as much as on force of arms. In Bithynia Pontus, Pompey divided the region into clearly defined provinces, implementing Roman legal frameworks and provincial governance structures. Cities that had previously fallen under Pontic authority, Amasea, Sinope, and Nicomedia, were garrisoned to deter residual resistance. Military settlements, strategically located along trade corridors and river valleys, provided both defense and rapid response capabilities. Roman tax collectors and provincial administrators replaced Pontic fiscal officials, standardizing taxation according to practices established elsewhere in the Republic. Publicani, operating under strict oversight, collected tribute and ensured the flow of resources to Rome while minimizing arbitrary exactions that had previously fueled local resentment. Further south, Pompey restructured territories formerly under Armenian influence. Syrian cities, Antioch, Seleucia, and the coastal harbors were integrated into a combination of direct Roman oversight and client kingships. He restored the Seleucid dynasty in a limited capacity in some regions while simultaneously securing loyalty through tribute obligations, garrison placement, and legal recognition. Cilicia, previously a region prone to piracy and lawlessness, was transformed through a combination of naval patrols and provincial administration. Pompey's earlier experience suppressing Mediterranean piracy informed the measures, ensuring safe shipping lanes and secure commerce from the Aegean to the Levant. Trade routes, both terrestrial and maritime, became a central component of Pompey's settlement strategy. Control over the southern Black Sea coast, Pontic rivers, and the Anatolian interior allowed Rome to regulate movement of grain, metals, and other strategic commodities. Cities along the Silk Road tributaries were mapped and subordinated to provincial authority, enabling taxation and customs enforcement. Roman administration emphasized predictability and continuity, discouraging local elites from opportunistic defiance while fostering economic stability that could support ongoing military presence. The reorganization extended beyond provincial boundaries. Pompey established client kingdoms as buffer states to reduce direct military burden. Local rulers, previously aligned with Mithridates or Tigranes, were reasserted under Roman suzerainty. These client kingships, ranging from Cappadocia to smaller Anatolian polities, provided internal security, administered local justice, and contributed troops when necessary. By delegating authority strategically, Pompey maintained overarching control without overextending Roman resources. Legal and civic reforms accompanied territorial restructuring. Roman law was introduced to provincial courts, standardizing dispute resolution, property claims, and commercial regulation. Municipal elites were incorporated into administrative hierarchies, incentivizing cooperation through political recognition and economic opportunity. Urban fortifications were repaired or expanded, reinforcing the perception of Roman authority and deterring insurgency. Public works, such as roads and aqueducts, facilitated movement of troops and goods, further stabilizing the region. Economic stabilization also played a crucial role in consolidating Roman control. Pompey established regular tax assessment systems and ensured that collection was both predictable and sustainable. Coinage, already circulating in Hellenistic patterns, was standardized to facilitate commerce. Trade fairs, particularly in cities like Amasea and Antioch, were encouraged under Roman oversight, creating economic hubs that linked the eastern provinces to broader Mediterranean markets. By ensuring economic integration, Pompey reduced the likelihood of unrest driven by fiscal grievance, transforming former conflict zones into productive territories within the Republic's framework. The administrative overhaul reflected a combination of military insight and bureaucratic innovation. Pompey understood that regions conquered in decades-long wars could quickly revert to resistance if governance was fragmented. His settlement emphasized hierarchy, accountability, and surveillance, with Roman governors, military prefects, and client kings working in tandem. The structure allowed rapid response to any resurgence of Pontic or Armenian influence and provided a framework for long-term provincial stability. Mithridates, though exiled to the Bosporan kingdom, continued to pose a potential threat. Even in political isolation, his influence among remaining loyalists and coastal cities in the Black Sea region required monitoring. Roman administration incorporated intelligence gathering, diplomatic outreach, and naval presence to anticipate any attempt by Mithridates to reassert authority. The integration of governance and military readiness ensured that potential resistance could be addressed swiftly before it gained momentum. By the end of Pompey's eastern settlement, Rome had effectively neutralized the structural foundations that had allowed Mithridates and Tigranes to challenge its authority. The former Pontic heartland, once the center of regional military and economic power, was reconfigured into a combination of Roman provinces and client states, linked by secure roads, standardized taxation, and administrative oversight. Syrian and Cilician territories were stabilized under similar principles, ensuring continuity of supply, trade, and legal order. The strategic success of Pompey's administrative program extended beyond immediate security. It established a model for Eastern governance that would influence Rome's approach to provincial management for decades. By combining military occupation with civic integration, economic stabilization, and legal standardization, Pompey ensured that the Eastern Mediterranean became a durable extension of Roman authority. The king who resisted Rome could not command loyalty at home. After his flight from Pontus in 66 BCE, Mithridates VI established a precarious seat of power in the Bosporan kingdom, along the northern Black Sea coast. Though geographically distant from Roman-controlled Anatolia, Mithridates retained ambition to restore his former dominions and mount renewed operations against Rome. He maintained a small but loyal force, reinforced by mercenaries and local contingents, and sought to rebuild alliances with regional powers along the Pontic littoral. Mithridates' plans, however, faced structural challenges. The Bosporan kingdom was politically fragmented, and local elites resented the imposition of a foreign monarch with Pontic aspirations. Records from ancient historians, including Appian, indicate that troop morale was uneven. Some cohorts remained loyal from Pontus, while others were motivated primarily by pay or personal security. The logistical and political limits of this exile base curtailed Mithridates' capacity to project power effectively. The tipping point occurred in 63 BCE when Mithridates' son, Pharnaces II, instigated a rebellion. Pharnaces commanded both native Bosporan forces and segments of Mithridates' remaining Pontic troops. Motivations were complex. A combination of personal ambition, strategic calculation, and perception of Roman inevitability led Pharnaces to assert authority independently. Troops, fatigued by years of campaigning and aware of Rome's overwhelming resources, increasingly aligned with Pharnaces, eroding the king's support from within. Mithridates attempted to suppress the revolt with the limited forces available. Tactical engagements were brief and localized, reflecting both the king's diminished capacity and the fragmented loyalties of his soldiers. Efforts to rally mercenary contingents or reinforce garrisons met with inconsistent results. Archaeological and textual evidence from Bosporan fortifications suggests that defensive positions were undermanned, reflecting the erosion of centralized authority. Political isolation compounded military vulnerability. Mithridates' prior alliances in Anatolia and Armenia were no longer viable. Tigranes II had ceased significant intervention, and local Black Sea rulers prioritized survival under Roman oversight. Pharnaces' rebellion therefore exploited both structural weakness and regional acquiescence to Rome, leaving Mithridates without credible support. In the final phase, Mithridates' position became untenable. Sources indicate he sought refuge and considered suicide to avoid capture. Facing both insubordination and imminent defeat, he ultimately ended his own life in 63 BCE. His death eliminated the last organized resistance associated with the Pontic monarchy. The Bosporan revolt, though internally motivated, thus functioned as the concluding mechanism of Pontic collapse, ending decades of opposition to Roman expansion. The final act was not Roman execution, but self-determined death. In 63 BCE, facing the collapse of his power in the Bosporan kingdom and the betrayal of his son Pharnaces II, Mithridates VI confronted the end of his decades-long struggle against Rome. Reports from Appian, Plutarch, and other classical historians describe his attempt to ingest poison as a final recourse. Mithridates, who had long cultivated immunity to various toxins through gradual exposure, a practice that had earned him the epithet Poison King, found that his usual methods were ineffective. The failure of poison forced him to adopt an alternative method. He arranged his own death by the sword, ensuring that Roman forces could not claim responsibility. This act demonstrated both the enduring authority he maintained over his personal fate and the symbolic closure of his reign. By taking his own life, Mithridates terminated the last vestige of centralized Pontic leadership capable of contesting Roman authority. His death marked the conclusion of 3 decades of sustained military and political confrontation, encompassing the First, Second, and Third Mithridatic Wars. From Anatolia to Armenia, the Black Sea littoral to the Levant, Roman forces had systematically dismantled Pontic territorial, economic, and military structures. Cities, fortresses, and trade routes that had once served as foundations of Mithridates' power were integrated into Roman provincial administration. The Republic now controlled a contiguous eastern Mediterranean sphere extending from the Aegean to the northern Black Sea. In the immediate aftermath, Pharnaces II assumed nominal rule of the Bosporan kingdom under Roman suzerainty. His alignment with Rome reflected the broader strategic realignment in the region. Former Pontic allies were co-opted into client kingships or subordinated through provincial governance. Roman authority was secured without protracted occupation of every city, relying instead on garrisons, client rulers, and the projection of military power to maintain compliance. Economically, the integration of Pontic territories into the Roman system stabilized trade and taxation. Previously contested Black Sea trade routes were secured, connecting grain, timber, and metals to Asia Minor and the broader Mediterranean. Cities that had served as Pontic administrative centers were repurposed as provincial hubs, reinforcing both economic continuity and political oversight. Pompey's prior reforms in Bithynia, Cilicia, and Syria provided a template for consistent governance across the former Pontic realm. The strategic impact of Mithridates' death extended beyond Pontus. Regional powers, including Armenia and Cappadocia, recalibrated their policies to acknowledge Roman supremacy. The elimination of a central, charismatic adversary reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance. Rome's eastern frontier now possessed both military security and administrative coherence, setting conditions for subsequent Republican interventions and, ultimately, imperial consolidation in the region. Militarily, the Roman legions benefited from the transition. With the cessation of active Pontic resistance, troops could be rotated, redeployed, or demobilized without risk of immediate insurgency. Pompey's command structure, already proven effective, now faced fewer operational uncertainties. The final victory emphasized that sustained campaigns, disciplined logistics, and centralized command could overcome even the most persistent and strategically adept opponents. Mithridates' end also had symbolic consequences. For Rome, it represented the triumph of systematic military and administrative organization over a resilient but ultimately isolated challenger. The narrative of resistance and exile underscored the difficulty of opposing Roman power, reinforcing the Republic's projection of authority across the eastern Mediterranean. Classical historians preserved these events as exemplars of strategic inevitability. Even a king of extraordinary skill and determination could not overcome the institutional and logistical superiority of Rome. In conclusion, Mithridates' suicide terminated organized Pontic resistance and enabled the Republic to consolidate territorial, economic, and administrative control in Anatolia and the Black Sea region. The conflict, which had shaped decades of Eastern Mediterranean politics, ended not through battlefield annihilation alone, but through a combination of strategic victory, administrative reorganization, and the removal of the central figure of opposition. History remembered him as Rome's most persistent Eastern adversary. Mithridates VI occupies a complex position in classical historiography. Ancient sources depict him both as a tyrant who orchestrated the Asiatic Vespers and as a formidable opponent who challenged the might of Rome for decades. Greek and Roman historians, including Appian, Plutarch, and Strabo, emphasized his intelligence, military skill, and strategic foresight, portraying him as a king who combined Persian royal traditions with Hellenistic statecraft. At the same time, these sources criticized his brutality, political cunning, and persistent attempts to disrupt Roman authority. The duality of Mithridates' portrayal reflects the intersection of fact, political agenda, and cultural perception. Roman writers, conscious of the need to justify decades of costly warfare, framed him as a dangerous Eastern monarch who threatened the stability of the Republic. Yet their accounts also convey admiration for his resilience and tactical ingenuity. Appian, for example, repeatedly notes Mithridates' ability to evade capture, rebuild forces after defeat, and challenge Rome in multiple theaters, suggesting respect for his strategic capabilities even as he is condemned morally. Greek authors often cast Mithridates in a more sympathetic light, emphasizing his role as a protector of Greek cities against Roman imposition. The massacre of Roman and Italian residents in 88 BCE, the Asiatic Vespers, remained a controversial event, and interpretations varied. Some emphasized the calculated brutality of his orders, while others contextualized it as a reaction to Roman exploitation and local grievances. In Hellenistic-influenced accounts, Mithridates emerges as a ruler navigating the pressures of empire, diplomacy, and cultural plurality in Anatolia and the Black Sea region. Historical memory also preserved his reputation as a polymath and medical innovator. His lifelong experimentation with poisons, including the practice of self-immunization, became legendary. These accounts, while sometimes exaggerated, reinforce the image of Mithridates as both intellectually sophisticated and ruthlessly pragmatic, a king whose personal discipline mirrored his approach to statecraft and military organization. Roman political and military narratives used Mithridates' example to illustrate both the dangers of Eastern monarchs and the virtues of Roman perseverance. Cicero and Plutarch highlighted the challenges faced by commanders such as Lucullus and Pompey, framing their victories as proof of Roman discipline, cohesion, and administrative capability. In these narratives, Mithridates functions as a foil. His skill and persistence magnify the achievements of Roman generals while underscoring the strategic necessity of extraordinary command. Mithridates' memory influenced subsequent historiography of the Eastern Mediterranean. Later authors often referenced the Mithridatic Wars when discussing the challenges of Roman expansion, coalition warfare, and frontier administration. The wars also shaped perceptions of the Black Sea, Anatolia, and Armenia as zones of strategic complexity and political volatility. Even centuries later, Mithridates' campaigns were cited as examples of resilient opposition against Rome, reinforcing the archetype of the Eastern monarch as simultaneously threatening and sophisticated. Despite his ultimate defeat, Mithridates' legacy endured through the structural consequences of the wars. His resistance forced Rome to develop new approaches to provincial administration, military command, and diplomacy in the East. The narrative surrounding his life provided both cautionary and instructive models for Roman statesmen, shaping policy and historiography alike. Before diving deeper into history, hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to get your daily Nightfall video, and leave a comment sharing your favorite part of this epic story. Your support helps keep these long-form historical documentaries coming.